The most dangerous thing in the room isn't the one making noise. The air inside the Imperial Hall held steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfectly regulated, perfectly controlled, like everything else in the Empress's domain. And yet Ethan Cole could feel the tension beneath it, subtle shifts in posture, the faint hum of energy fields cycling behind the walls, the quiet language of a place designed to remind every visitor exactly how small they were. And he stood there among towering figures of polished armor and iridescent skin, a human in a simple translator's uniform, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes moving just enough to notice exits, distances, timing, while above him the vaulted ceiling shimmered with artificial starlight that never flickered, never failed, because failure was not something this empire tolerated. And when the great doors parted with a soft hydraulic sigh, every presence in the room adjusted without a word, shoulders squared, heads lowered. Attention pulled toward the single figure who entered like gravity itself had shifted, Empress Zyra Veth, her steps measured, her gaze distant and precise, a ruler accustomed to being obeyed before she even spoke. And when her eyes finally settled on Ethan, there was a pause, brief but deliberate, like she had found something mildly amusing in an otherwise predictable day. "You," she said, her voice smooth, amplified just enough to carry without effort. The human interpreter. And Ethan inclined his head, not submissive, not defiant, just enough, because on his world, balance mattered more than pride. "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied, tone even, the translation system in his collar flickering once as it aligned with her language, and a faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through the chamber as she stepped closer, studying him like an artifact rather than a person. "You exist," she continued, "to repeat the words of those who matter." And for a moment the room waited for a reaction, some sign of discomfort, some instinctive flinch, but Ethan didn't give it to them. He simply adjusted his stance by half an inch, shifting his weight to his back foot, a habit no one here understood, because on Earth, standing still was rarely the same as being safe. And the Empress noticed the movement, subtle as it was, her expression narrowing just slightly, curiosity threading through her earlier amusement. "Tell me," she said, circling him now, slow, deliberate. "Does your kind always hide behind silence?" And Ethan's eyes lifted just enough to meet hers, not challenging, just present. "On my world," he said quietly, "silence isn't hiding." A beat passed, long enough for the translation to settle. Across the chamber, it's listening. And somewhere behind them, a system recalibrated with a soft click, unnoticed by most. But Ethan heard it, cataloged it, filed it away without thought, because that was what survival had taught him, not strength, not dominance, but awareness. And as the Empress studied him again, the faintest trace of something new entered her gaze, not respect, not yet, but interest. And in a room designed to make everything predictable, that alone was enough to change the atmosphere. The chamber did not return to normal, not completely, because once attention shifts, it never settles back into the same pattern, and Ethan could feel it in the way the guards adjusted their stance by a fraction, in the way distant consoles pulsed half a second out of rhythm, in the way the Empress did not immediately dismiss him as she had clearly intended to do at first. Instead, she moved past him and took her place on the elevated throne, a structure carved from dark crystal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And as she sat, the entire room recalibrated around her presence, yet her gaze did not leave him for long. "You listen," she said after a moment, her tone quieter now, more precise. "Then tell me, human, what do you hear in a room like this?" And Ethan did not rush to answer. He let the question exist, measured it, because on Earth, the wrong answer given too quickly could cost more than silence ever would. "I hear systems working harder than they should," he said finally, voice steady, and a subtle shift passed through the nearest technicians as if they had been called out without being named. "I hear people waiting for permission to act." Another pause, longer this time. "And I hear something that does not belong." The last statement hung in the air, not loud, not dramatic, just placed there like a fact. And for the first time the Empress leaned forward slightly, interest sharpening into focus. "Explain," she said, and Ethan glanced toward one of the side corridors, not directly, just enough, a movement so small it could have been missed by anyone not watching for it. On my world, he continued, we learn early that patterns matter, and when something breaks the pattern, you do not ignore it. He did not elaborate further, did not point, did not accuse, because that was not his role here. And yet the implication was clear enough that a low hum of activity began along the edges of the chamber, discreet, controlled, but present, and the Empress raised one hand, stopping it instantly, her eyes never leaving Ethan. You speak as if your world trained you for this, she said, and there was something new in her voice now. Something measured against his calm rather than dismissing it. It did not train me for this place, Ethan replied. It trained me to stay alive in places that look calm. The distinction settled between them, subtle but undeniable, and the Empress studied him again, longer this time, as if recalculating something she had assumed was already understood. You are a translator, she said slowly, and yet you behave like something else. Ethan allowed the faintest trace of a breath, almost a quiet exhale. On Earth, he said, titles matter less than outcomes. And somewhere deep in the structure, another soft shift echoed through the walls, too quiet for most, but not for him, not for her either, because her posture changed by a fraction, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were both listening. And in that silence, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if it were waiting to reveal whether his observation was caution or something far more important. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like pressure slowly releasing from a sealed room, and Ethan could feel the shift ripple outward from the Empress's stillness. Her hand lowering by less than an inch as if she had decided something without needing to announce it. And the guards responded in kind, not moving forward, not retreating, just adjusting their awareness to a new center, one that now included the human who had spoken out of place without raising his voice. And somewhere along the curved walls, a panel emitted a soft harmonic tone, almost musical, almost pleasant, but it did not belong in a room calibrated for silence, and Ethan's eyes moved. Again, not directly, never directly, tracking reflections in polished surfaces, counting the delay between sound and response, measuring distance in the way his world had taught him, because on Earth, danger rarely arrived with an introduction. It slipped in quietly, disguised as routine, and the Empress noticed the way his attention shifted, not frantic, not afraid, just precise. You believe something is wrong, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber without effort, and Ethan answered the way he always did when certainty was still forming. I believe something changed, he said, and that distinction lingered longer than any accusation would have, because change implied a before and an after, a disruption of control, and control was the foundation of everything here. The Empress rose from her throne, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the kind of deliberate motion that drew every eye without demanding it, and she descended the steps slowly, each one measured, until she stood level with Ethan again, closer now than before, close enough that most would have lowered their gaze out of instinct. But he did not. He simply remained present, aware, and she studied him as if recalculating an equation that no longer balanced. On your world, she said. When something changes, what do your people do? And Ethan considered the answer, not because he did not know it, but because truth required precision. We do not wait for permission, he said, and the translation carried the weight of it into every corner of the chamber, not as defiance, but as a statement of fact, and a faint stir moved through the court, quickly suppressed, because even the idea of acting without command felt foreign here, and yet the Empress did not correct him, did not dismiss him. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across her own domain as if seeing it through a different lens for the first time, and that was when it happened again. The harmonic tone, slightly off, slightly closer, followed by a barely perceptible shift in the air pressure, enough to register, not enough to alarm anyone who had not learned to trust small signals. And Ethan's voice came again, softer this time, almost a suggestion. Your Majesty, he said, the pattern is repeating. And now the room felt it too, not understanding, but sensing, like a change in weather before the storm, and the Empress's eyes returned to him, sharper now, no trace of amusement left. Then speak, she said, before it finishes changing. And Ethan did not raise his voice, did not step forward. He simply said the one thing that mattered. It is already inside the system. And for the first time, control in the room did not disappear, but it bent, just slightly, toward the human who had learned to survive by noticing what others ignored. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, as if the room itself understood their weight before anyone else did. And for a fraction of a second no one moved. Not the guards, not the technicians, not even the Empress. Because the idea that something had already breached their system without detection was not just a threat. It was a contradiction to everything they believed about their control. And yet the evidence was there in the subtle inconsistencies Ethan had been tracking since. He stepped into the chamber. The delayed responses, the harmonic tone that did not belong, the slight fluctuation in air pressure that repeated just often enough to form a pattern, and the Empress's gaze sharpened as she turned away from him, not dismissing, but expanding her awareness outward. "Seal internal channels," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that snapped the room into motion without panic. And along the walls, panels shifted, soft light lines pulsing as systems rerouted and isolated segments of the network. But Ethan did not relax. He did not step back, because on his world, the moment after you think you have control is often when you lose it, and he watched instead, tracking the timing of each command as it executed, measuring the gap between intent and response. And it was there again, small, almost imperceptible, but consistent, a delay that did not match the system's design. "It is not stopping," he said quietly, not interrupting, just adding a layer to the unfolding situation, and the nearest technician glanced up, confusion flickering across their features as their console displayed compliance across all sectors. "All channels are sealed," the technician reported, voice steady but uncertain, and the Empress did not look at them. Her attention returned to Ethan, weighing his certainty against the data presented. "Then explain why it continues," she said, and Ethan took a single step to the side, not toward the center, not toward her, but toward a reflective surface built into one of the structural columns, his eyes. Not on the console displays, but on the faint distortion in the reflection, a ripple that aligned perfectly with the harmonic tone. "Because it is not using your channels," he said, and now the room shifted again, not in movement, but in understanding, the idea threading through the gathered minds that the system they trusted might not be the system being used, and the Empress followed his line of sight, her perception recalibrating in real time. "An external layer," she murmured, "more to herself than anyone else," and Ethan gave the smallest nod. "A layer that learned your patterns," he added, "and now moves between them." And the implication settled deeper than any alarm could have, because something that could move unseen through their structure was not just present, it was adaptive, and the Empress straightened, her presence sharpening into something colder, more focused, not anger, not fear, but decision. "Then we remove the pattern," she said, and the room stilled again. Waiting, because removing a pattern meant changing everything at once, and Ethan's voice came once more, calm, precise. "If you do it all at once, it will adjust," he said, and her eyes locked onto his, not as a ruler to a subject, but as one mind measuring another. "Then how would your world handle it?" she asked, and for the first time, there was no mockery in her tone, only a question, and Ethan answered without hesitation. "We do not break the system," he said. "We become unpredictable inside it." And the silence that followed was different now, not empty, but charged, because unpredictability was not something this empire practiced, and yet in that moment, it might have been the only advantage they had. Unpredictable was not a strategy this empire understood. It was something they had spent generations eliminating, refining every process until outcomes could be calculated before they began. And now a human stood in the center of their control, suggesting the one thing their system was not designed to handle, and the Empress did not reject it. She considered it, her gaze shifting across the chamber, as if she were seeing every routine, every pattern, every expected sequence laid out in front of her at once. "Define unpredictable," she said, not as a challenge, but as a command for clarity, and Ethan did not rush. He never rushed when timing mattered. "Change one thing at a time," he replied, "but not the thing it expects." And the room absorbed that, technicians exchanging brief glances before returning to their consoles, because the instruction was simple. But the application required trust in a method they had never used, and the Empress lifted her hand again, slower this time, more deliberate. Initiate staggered variants, she ordered, and the words themselves felt foreign in the chamber, like introducing a new language into a system built on precision. And along the walls, the light patterns shifted, no longer uniform, no longer synchronized, each segment adjusting its cycle by a fraction, a second here, a second there. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to disrupt the perfect rhythm the system had relied on. And Ethan watched closely, not the changes themselves, but the response to them, because whatever had entered their system was not passive, it was observing, adapting, and for a moment, nothing happened. The harmonic tone continued, the air pressure held steady, the chamber remained intact, and then the pattern broke, not loudly, not violently, but subtly. The tone hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. It noticed, he said, and the Empress did not look at him this time. She was already ahead of the moment. Continue, she commanded, and the variations increased, not faster, not stronger, just more irregular, like a heartbeat that refused to settle into a rhythm, and the system began to shift in response, small recalibrations triggering across the network as it attempted to compensate for the inconsistencies. And that was when the distortion in the reflection changed, no longer smooth, no longer hidden between patterns. It flickered, just once, enough to confirm what Ethan had been tracking since the beginning. There, he said quietly, and for the first time, the entire room focused on the same point, not because they could all see it, but because they trusted the precision of the one who could. And the Empress stepped closer to the column, her eyes scanning the surface, her perception adjusting to detect what her system had missed, and slowly, the faint outline became visible, not a shape, not a form, but an absence, a place where the pattern did not align with itself. It is masking within your consistency, Ethan said, his voice steady. And now it cannot keep up, and the implication settled in, not as fear, but as realization that something had entered their domain, believing it understood them, believing their predictability was a strength, and now that assumption was failing, and the Empress straightened, her presence shifting once more, no longer amused, no longer merely curious, but engaged. Then we do not let it adapt, she said, and this time, there was no hesitation in the room, no uncertainty, because the method was no longer foreign, it was working. And Ethan allowed himself the smallest shift in posture, not relaxation, never that, but recognition, because on his world, survival was not about overpowering what threatened you. It was about outlasting it, outthinking it, and in a chamber that had once felt perfectly controlled, the most human element had become the most valuable one. The distortion did not disappear when it was seen, it reacted. And that reaction was the first true confirmation that it was not just present but aware, the faint absence in the reflection tightening as the system's irregular rhythms pressed against it from every direction. And Ethan could feel the shift in the room as understanding turned into intent, because once something hidden is revealed, the next question is not what it is, but what it will do. And the Empress stood still for a moment. Longer, her eyes fixed on the subtle anomaly as if measuring not its shape, but its response time, its adaptability, its limits. It is learning, she said, not as a warning, but as a calculation, and Ethan nodded once, small, precise. It already has, he replied. But now it has to learn something new every second. And that was the advantage, not strength, not speed, but pressure, continuous and unpredictable, forcing whatever was inside their system to spend energy adapting instead of advancing. And the chamber responded to her next command before she even finished speaking. Increase variance intervals, she said, and the patterns along the walls fractured further, no longer resembling any consistent cycle, each segment shifting independently, overlapping, colliding in ways that would have been considered inefficient before, but now created a field of constant change. And the harmonic tone faltered again, this time longer, stretching just enough to reveal its origin point. More clearly, a localized inconsistency near the column Ethan had identified, and the technicians saw it now, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know where to focus, and a low murmur of controlled activity moved through the room as they adjusted their instruments, recalibrating sensors to detect what had previously been filtered out as noise, and the Empress took one step closer, her presence narrowing, focusing. "Can it leave?" she asked, and Ethan's answer came without delay. "If it recognizes the threat," he said, "it will try." And that possibility shifted the stakes, because containment was no longer enough. They had to force a decision, trap or exit. And the Empress's expression did not change, but something in her posture settled, a decision made at a level deeper than command. "Then we close the exits it expects," she said, and the system responded instantly, not by sealing everything, but by selectively reinforcing certain pathways while leaving others subtly altered, creating a map that looked familiar on the surface but behaved differently underneath. And Ethan watched the distortion again, not where it was, but where it might move, tracking the slight changes in its position as the system around it became less predictable, and for a moment, it held, as if calculating, as if searching for a stable pattern to anchor itself to, but there was none, not anymore. And that was when it shifted, not disappearing, not escaping, but moving, a faint displacement across the reflective surface that confirmed it had chosen action over concealment. "There," Ethan said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying a quiet certainty that drew every eye again. And the Empress followed the movement, her perception now aligned with his, her understanding no longer bound by the assumptions of her system. "It is trying to find order," she said, and Ethan gave the smallest nod. "And we do not give it one," he replied, and the room held that truth, not as a tactic, but as a principle, because in a place built on control, the greatest disruption was not force, it was unpredictability. And as the distortion shifted again, more visibly now, the balance of the chamber changed with it, not in favor of power, but in favor of awareness. And for the first time since Ethan had entered, the system was no longer leading the room, the people inside it were. The movement was no longer subtle, it was deliberate, and that changed everything. Because something that chooses to move reveals more than something that hides, and Ethan tracked it not by what it was, but by what it disrupted, the faint distortion sliding along the reflective surface, hesitating whenever the system around it fractured into irregular pulses, accelerating when it sensed even the smallest trace of consistency. And that told him more than any scan ever could. "Prefers stability," he said quietly, and the Empress did not question him, not now. Her attention locked onto the same shifting absence. "Then we remove every trace of it," she replied, and the chamber responded again, the controlled chaos deepening, patterns breaking faster, intervals shifting beyond what any automated system would normally tolerate. And for a moment it felt wrong, inefficient, almost fragile. But Ethan knew better, because on his world, survival rarely looked efficient from the outside. It looked messy, unpredictable, alive, and the distortion reacted immediately, its movement becoming sharper, less calculated, as if it were searching for something it could no longer find. And the technicians saw it too now, not clearly, but enough to follow, their instruments finally tuned to the same irregularity Ethan had sensed from the beginning. "It is accelerating," one of them reported, and the Empress's gaze narrowed, not in concern, but in focus, "because it is losing control," Ethan said, and that was the key, not trapping it, not overpowering it, but forcing it into a state where its own adaptability became a weakness, where every adjustment cost it more than it gained. And the distortion shifted again, faster this time, slipping across the column and into open air, no longer anchored to the surface, just a flicker of absence moving through space. And the room felt it, not as a threat, but as a change in pressure, a subtle awareness that something unseen was now fully exposed. And for the first time, the Empress moved not with measured precision, but with intent, stepping into its path, not to block it, but to observe it up close, her presence steady, unshaken. "It cannot maintain its concealment," she said, and Ethan nodded once. "Because concealment requires predictability," he replied, "and we took that away." And the distortion faltered again, just for a fraction of a second, enough to reveal a clearer outline, not a form, not a creature, but a structure, layered, adaptive, something that had been built to read patterns and move between them, and now found itself in a system that refused to be read, and the Empress saw it, truly saw it for the first time, her expression shifting not to fear, but to understanding. "It came here expecting order," she said, and Ethan's voice followed, quiet, certain, "and found something else." And the room held that truth, not as a victory, but as a turning point, because whatever this presence was, it had entered a world it thought it understood, and now that understanding was gone, replaced by something far more difficult to navigate. And as the distortion slowed, its movement no longer smooth, no longer confident. The balance shifted completely, not toward strength, but toward awareness, and for the first time, the human in the room was no longer the smallest presence. He was the one who understood the rules that had just changed. The chamber no longer felt like a place of certainty. It felt alive, shifting, reacting, every surface carrying a rhythm that refused to settle. And in that instability, the distortion slowed even further, not because it was weakening, but because it could no longer predict what came next, and that hesitation became visible, a faint layering in the air where its structure struggled to align with anything stable. And Ethan watched it the way he always had, not chasing it, not confronting it, but letting it reveal itself through its own need for control. "It is trying to rebuild a pattern," he said, voice low, measured, and the Empress stood just a few feet away from the flickering anomaly, her presence steady, unshaken by its proximity. "Then we give it one," she replied, and for a moment the room stilled, not completely, but just enough, a single controlled interval where the system aligned again, not as it had before, but in a narrow, intentional sequence, and the distortion reacted. Instantly, drawn to the consistency like a signal, its structure tightening, becoming clearer, more defined as it attempted to anchor itself to the brief moment of order. And that was when Ethan moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a single step, shifting the timing again, breaking the sequence before it could fully stabilize, and the distortion faltered sharply, caught between adaptation and loss, and the Empress saw it. Understood it. "It depends on predictability to exist," she said, and Ethan nodded. "Not just to move," he replied, "to hold itself together." And that realization changed the strategy entirely, because they were no longer trying to find it. They were forcing it into a state where it could not maintain itself. And the Empress raised her hand once more, her command immediate, precise, alternate between order and chaos, she said. And the chamber obeyed, patterns forming and breaking in rapid succession, brief moments of alignment followed by unpredictable shifts, a system that no longer chose one state, but moved between both, and the distortion reacted with increasing instability, its outline flickering more frequently, its position no longer smooth, but fragmented, as if it were being pulled in multiple directions at once, unable to decide which pattern to follow, and the technicians watched in controlled silence, their instruments finally registering fluctuations that had been invisible before, each spike, each dip aligning with the shifts in the system's rhythm, confirming what Ethan had sensed from the beginning. And the Empress stepped even closer, her eyes fixed on the now unstable presence, not with fear, but with clarity. "It is unraveling," she said, and Ethan's voice followed, steady as ever, "because it cannot exist without knowing what comes next." And the room held that truth, not as a victory, but as an understanding of something deeper, that control, when absolute, becomes predictable, and predictability can be broken. And as the distortion flickered again, more violently now, its structure no longer able to maintain coherence within the shifting system, the balance of power in the chamber changed completely, not through force, not through dominance, but through the simple act of refusing to be understood. And in that moment, the human who had once been dismissed as irrelevant had become the one guiding an empire through something it had never faced before, not by overpowering it, but by making it impossible for the threat to understand the world it had entered. The distortion did not collapse all at once, it unraveled in fragments, each flicker less stable than the last, as the chamber continued to shift between order and unpredictability, never settling long enough for the presence to anchor itself again. And Ethan remained still, his eyes tracking the final movements not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty, because he had seen this before in different forms, on a world where systems failed, where patterns broke, where survival depended on recognizing the moment when something could no longer adapt. And this was that moment, the point where the anomaly stopped searching and started failing. Its structure flickering rapidly now, not moving with intention, but reacting without direction, caught between conflicting inputs it could not resolve. And the Empress stood just feet away, her gaze fixed on the unstable presence, not as a ruler confronting a threat, but as a mind observing the limits of something that had once seemed beyond her control. "It cannot choose," she said quietly, and Ethan's voice followed, just as calm, "because every choice leads to a different pattern." And the truth of it settled across the chamber, that the very adaptability which had allowed it to enter unnoticed had now become its weakness, because adaptation requires a foundation, and that foundation had been removed, replaced with something fluid, something human, and the distortion flickered one last time, a final attempt to stabilize against a system that refused to hold still. And then it was gone, not destroyed, not forced out, but unable to remain, its absence leaving the air strangely still, as if the room itself had exhaled. And for a long moment, no one spoke, because what had just happened was not a victory in the way they understood it. There had been no force, no dominance, only a shift in how the world inside the chamber behaved. And the Empress slowly turned her attention back to Ethan, her expression no longer carrying even a trace of her earlier amusement. "Your world," she said, her voice lower now, more measured. "It made you like this?" And Ethan did not nod, did not confirm. He simply stood there, as he had from the beginning, present, aware, unchanged. "My world does not give you a choice," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it was not pride, not a claim of superiority. It was a fact, and the Empress studied him for a long moment, not as a subject, not as a tool, but as something she had misjudged, something she had underestimated not because it was hidden, but because it did not present itself in a way her system recognized. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she inclined her head, not deeply, not formally, but enough, a gesture so rare that the chamber seemed to pause around it. And when she spoke again, her words were not directed to the room, but to him alone. "You listened," she said, and Ethan's response was quiet, almost reflective. "I had to." And the silence that followed was different from before.